I don't look at it as community being those individuals that work from the basement at night and vendors. Actually, I see vendors as part of the community. They have vested interests, and it's fine.
This is DevOps Paradox, episode number 223. Vendors and communities working together in open source. Welcome to DevOps Paradox. This is a podcast about random stuff in which we, Darren and Victor, pretend we know what we're talking about. Most of the time, we mask our ignorance by putting the word DevOps everywhere we can and mix it with random buzzwords like Kubernetes, serverless, CI/CD, team productivity, islands of happiness, and other fancy expressions that make us sound like we know what we're doing. Occasionally, we invite guests who do know something, but we do not do that often since they might make us look incompetent. The truth is out there, and there is no way we are going to find it. P.S. It's Darren reading this text and feeling embarrassed that Victor made me do it. Here are your hosts, Darren Pope and Victor Farsick. Victor, right now, at least as of August 9th, you're not on the road at any of the conferences. You're enjoying your holiday.
Yes, that's very strange and unexpected to me.
And why is that? Because for 2 years, we hadn't done any kind of travel. Now you're back traveling all the time. You're going to the KubeCons, you're going to the you name it's, right?
Yeah, I'm still in the mood of liking traveling, especially if I get invited to a country I haven't been yet, or a city. That will change. But for now, yes, I like traveling. But August, we made the executive decision in our house not to go anybody in August, 1 month a year.
Well, I think that's true for everybody in Europe, but I digress.
Sometimes it's July.
Okay, fair enough. But you realize, Victor, when you go to these places, there are people that are planning and laying out the red carpet for you. It just doesn't magically happen.
To be honest, I'm happy. You know, there are people who spend weeks, months, sometimes even years organizing, working every single day to organize something, and then I take a flight and come there as just kind of give a talk. I feel so privileged in a way that I don't have to do that work anymore, which sounds strange, right? That I don't have. I liked organizing events and conferences, and I have really full respect, especially that majority of people in my experience have no idea how much work it is to organize an event, even if it's a small one.
Now, on today's show, we have one of those people.
Those people that help make your life easier when you show up to do a conference talk. We have Dotan on. He works at Logs.io, but he's also a CNCF ambassador and also one of the organizers for KCD Tel Aviv, I believe. Is that correct?
Yeah, KCD Israel. Glad to be on the show. And I'm one of the organizers of the local CNCF chapter. So we have meetups all year round. And the KCD was the highlight. We just had the first one this year in March, which was a great success. And I like Victor's t-shirt. The listeners can't see that on the podcast, but I can see that that's the Kubernetes Community Days Israel t-shirt. So good point there, Victor, on the choice of wardrobe.
So this was the first KCD Israel. What was that like organizing? Because it's one thing to come in and work on an event that has been around for a while. There's lots of policies and procedures and people are familiar with everybody. But for a brand new event, what was that like?
That was, to be honest, quite a roller coaster. And that's not my day job, it's important to say. My day job is very similar to Victor, traveling as an advocate and talking on stage and having other people doing the hard work for me. But community is something that I have a passion for, and this is why I always get myself involved in some capacity in communities. For many years, I've been involved in DevOps Days Tel Aviv, which is by now one of the largest DevOps days in the world. As I grew closer to the CNCF and I wanted to invest more time in the CNCF and evolve also the local CNCF chapter, then the next natural thing was to have a full-fledged event, not just meetups, a full-fledged one-day event. We didn't take any production company or anything like that. So really the organizer team, together with some volunteers supporting us, we did that with our own bare hands, and it was challenging and it was interesting getting to know the sides regarding getting sponsorships. The CNCF doesn't sponsor any of the KCDs, the Kubernetes Community Days. It's very much grassroots, organized by the local communities themselves. So you need to find your own sponsors, your own venue. It's very low touch as far as the CNCF goes, unlike KubeCon and KubeDay and other events that are very centralized by the central CNCF. So we needed to understand how we do everything from escorting the speaker, from selection process, the CFP process, the content, the escorting the speakers, deciding on the way to MC the event, the venue itself, the catering, of course the sponsors, and many other things. So quite an adventure.
You laughed at catering. What happened?
You get surprised every time with something that you wouldn't expect the day of. No matter how many preparations and calls and setups you do, it can be with catering, it could be with the AV, with the screen, with a speaker that decided that he wants to give a live demo, although the original discussion was only a slide deck, and it's a different setup, and a gazillion other things. So really, not a dull moment. Let's put it this way.
So how large is the CNCF community in Israel? Are we talking tens, hundreds, thousands?
I would say hundreds. I don't have the exact number because it's not formal. You don't need to register and pay membership or anything like that. So it's essentially how many people we have on our Slack channel, on the CNCF Slack, of course, and how many people show up. And obviously some don't join the Slack and come to the meetups and vice versa and so on. The KCD itself, the Kubernetes Community Days, had over 400 people. So that's maybe a good number to reference. That was a full house. So that was the size of the venue. We decided to go to be modest and humble. For the first KCD, we went for a single track, which was also a decision that you need to make as an organizer. So, and we had enough of a demand to justify more than a single track, but we wanted to start with a single track, a relatively small venue, a small number of sponsors, and focus on really quality content. That was the first year's experience.
And do you think it was successful?
I think so, although I'm not objective, obviously. But the feedback that we got was amazing from both the speakers and from the audience, and also I see now the excitement around the Cube Day Israel that is taking place June 19th. By the time this episode is rolled up, it's going to be already a past tense, but it's now still upcoming, so excited about that. And the interest around the Cube Day Israel, although it's a different type of event, and it's, as I said, organized by the Cloud Native Computing Foundation centrally, not with the local community organizing it. Still, people relate to that because it's ultimately the same community, the same people that attend these events, and they see the level of excitement based on what we did back in March with the KCD. So good indications that keep the appetite for doing another KCD.
So with that in mind, you're wanting to do another KCD, but do you want to put yourself through that again?
That's always the question, how masochistic you want to be. There are lots of learnings from that, including increasing the amount of people that are involved from the organizer team, maybe outsourcing more of the things that we did ourselves for things that do not require the organizers themselves. So lots of learnings, but I think the ultimate sentiment, and you keep on forgetting very quickly the burden, and you're left with a good taste in your mouth. So I think that's what takes. But maybe you can hear from Victor. He was on stage there giving a talk. So maybe Victor can give this perspective from the speaker side of the house.
It was really well organized. For being the first event, I was actually surprised, like pleasantly surprised. Everything was round the clock. And all the people in organizer t-shirts were running around like chicken without heads, right? Kind of, I cannot speak with you now. I'm fixing this, and things like that. But everything really worked well. I was very pleased with it.
And tell them about the pre-event that we had, the dinner for the speakers and the after party, with the dancing and everything.
It's a combination of organizers were really, really good at organizing. I really like that when organizers organize not only a conference, but really night events or, out of the venue type of events. great food, great music. There were, I think, 2 things organized. One pre-event, like dinner or something like that, and then party somewhere else. And then it's Israel, right? Everybody had after parties organized. So I was jumping from one place to another. Absolutely great.
Yeah, and that's an important part. It's not just a community is more than just hearing lectures and talks. It's not a monologue and a unilateral stream. For me, community is a place to get together, and the hallway track is as important, if not more, than the talks themselves. And this is why, for us as organizers, it was very important first to have that intimate room for the speakers to get to know each other on the pre-event, dinner, and then just having everyone flowing from the venue to the nearby pub where we organized the after party with a live band and with dancing and drinks and food and everything, so that people could actually chat, digest all the lectures and talks and topics over a drink. In a good spirit, and create connections. Ultimately, it's all about connections, in my view.
Of course, I go to KubeCons and those big ones for, I would say, obvious reasons. But personally, actually, I prefer more events like KCDs than big ones, right? What you just said to me is key, right? It's more intimate, more conversations, more... You somehow, I have a feeling, accomplish more with less people.
I agree, and actually I'm going to KCD Munich, and I'm curious to see and learn from other KCDs and what we can improve on the experience. But I can tell you I heard from the fellows in Italy and other places that also took some engaging, after event things. That I think it proves itself, and it really lets people release and do their thing. So that's my take on that.
I know in your day job, you love the hallway track. Victor only talks about going to the hallway tracks. And if you don't understand what a hallway track is and you're listening to this, that's basically where you pay to go to a conference and never go to any of the sessions. And you just hang out in the hallway. That's the hallway track. As an organizer, it seems like to me, especially from a KCD perspective, if you're running a single track event, you would not want people hanging out in the hallway track. Or you would actually want to stomp out a hallway track.
So I don't think this was the spirit that we took. I think lots of people hang out there. Some people told me proudly that they only spend the time there hanging out, and I was really happy to hear that. So I think the auditorium that we had felt full, obviously varying degrees during the day, but it didn't feel empty. Also being one of the people who tried getting people in to close the doors and start the talks on time. But as I said, it's an essential part of the conference. So you don't present anything like that there, but it is essential. And by the way, there are other components that we didn't implement on this one, but like open spaces and others that give room that is not frontal lecture for people to interact and to communicate. And as I said, also after party and things like that. So all of that is part of the same thing. These are complementing elements for me. So I didn't feel that tension. Maybe if it had been emptier inside, maybe it would be more of a worry for me.
So you were able to strike a good balance. Now, would you ever consider doing a KCD-like event that was nothing but hallway track?
It's interesting. Actually, I can tell you that I have a few fellows from the Israeli community that are now trying to pull off something along these lines, and it should be like a weekend event with a sleepover and something like that. It's an interesting social experiment, as I told them as well, but it's dependent because you need the anchors. You need something, as far as I see it, the people. These are the anchors. These are the seeds for conversation, for chatting. So there is value in there. Just having a vacuum there, it feels to me too uprooted.
You cannot have only hallway track, I believe, because those talks are incentivizing people to come in the first place, even if they don't end up going on to talks, right? That's the incentive. And also it would be very hard to bring people outside of the community, outside of that city or whatever it is, if it wouldn't be a talk. Like, for example, I couldn't justify the travel to my company if it isn't a talk, right? But then if it is, hey, anything goes, right?
Yeah, definitely. Doing the case, you're as a speaker, you travel as a speaker, but people who just attend as attendees, when you want the workplace to pay for the fee, you need to show them some sort of an agenda for the managers to understand what the heck you're going to spend the day, not just the salary that they're paying you, but also the admission fee. So yeah, I think it's also an aspect.
That's similar to my experience when I went first and the only time to a baseball game in States. It was in San Francisco. Everybody went there because of the baseball game. And then nobody was watching the game, right? It turned out to be boring, and it was more interesting to drink beer and speak with people around you. But if it wasn't if it wasn't the game itself, people wouldn't come.
And I think another aspect in community is, I come from the open source realm, so CNCF and the open source projects. And I think there is a unique flavor of the community when you talk about open source. Because open source communities, first of all, they live also beyond the in-person. Most of the interaction actually happens offline, over Slack channels and obviously over GitHub or GitLab or wherever the repo is. I think the open source community has something that's very community-based, that's ingrained within the way that open source is even being fathomed and developed. And this is something that, for me, gives the passion. I started my journey back in OpenStack days. I don't know who remembers these days of the vision of the private cloud and open source based, and so I think Victor had touched that in the past, right?
I haven't touched it in a long while, but it's amazing idea that resulted in a lot of suffering.
Yeah, that's a good point. But the community there was amazing. That's one thing that I can say in favor of OpenStack. Also, as a community. And even some things, to be honest, that for the Linux Foundation to learn from them about the community way of engagement. I was one of the people who started the OpenStack Israel, the local community, and the events and activities around that. And so I think this aspect is amazing, especially when it's your open source. You need to build up the community, but when you join a massive open source like Prometheus or OpenTelemetry, giving some examples that I personally am involved with, then you join, I don't know the exact count, but thousands and more of people, depending if they're active or not, or so on and so forth, that around the world, different time zones, different languages, different use cases, different verticals, different companies, vendors, end users, or whatnot, all collaborating to make it better. And that's something that's amazing. Not to mention if two communities combine, for example, around KubeCon Europe just recently, we've announced, for example, that ECS, Elastic Common Schema, is going to merge into OpenTelemetry. That's an established community with a lot of mileage around log analytics and about how logs should look like and what's the semantic conventions and so on. And then bringing all this knowledge and all this human resourcing into OpenTelemetry, that's a major boost. And also not having competing specifications, but rather something that is combined for joint forces. So this is, again, something that is very powerful, that manifests in quality open source ultimately.
OpenTelemetry to me is so fascinating, to be honest. It doesn't happen often that companies, because let's face it, right? We all work in companies and we have, many of our companies are based on open source, but we have corporate interests, right? Business interests there as well. But OpenTelemetry somehow managed to force would be a wrong word, but to convince companies to actually stand behind something that might not even be on a short term in their interest, but it is very important nevertheless.
Yeah, I think it's amazing to see. It's today the second most active project in the CNCF, second only to Kubernetes itself. So that speaks for itself about how active it is. And when you look at the breakdown of companies, let's talk about not individual, but companies, you see all the major cloud providers, obviously Amazon and Microsoft and Google and whatnot, and also all the major monitoring and observability players involved. And that's a major testament. If you want to, I've seen, we talked about OpenStack, and we've seen many other cases of very promising open source projects that ultimately did not fulfill, not necessarily on the technical side of things, but also on the adoption side and becoming a real de facto standard. Although it's rather early to say, I think the signs are that OpenTelemetry is set to become a de facto standard because of the alignment around it, both by end users and by vendors. And you see, especially, I think you brought up a very good point, companies that have for years made their earnings out of selling agents. Very intelligent, very complex agents to instrument and collect telemetry data out of applications and do all sorts of smart stuff for APM and whatnot. But then again, you see even these companies contributing, getting involved with OpenTelemetry, providing offerings side by side or even replacing the existing agents, meaning that they realize they can't compete. They need to align because this is what the end user wants. And this is becoming like the standard for collecting, for generating. Now the shift is, that's my view, the shift goes towards the backend storage and analytics side of the house, and where you can create differentiation as a vendor. So that's the real power, in essence, the real power of OpenTelemetry as I see it.
The complicated part, or at least I have often difficulty explaining people that successful open source projects, especially those that are bigger, right, depend on two things. On one hand, we have community, as in people contributing during nights and weekends, outside of working hours. And then we have corporations, companies churning in, right? And for an open source project to become really successful, you cannot rely only on community, only on side hustle in a way, right? And very often when I speak about that, people are kind of dislike it. Oh, I want pure open source. I don't want any company contributing to it, having their interests and stuff like that, which I understand completely. But for all that to work, like OpenTelemetry to me is a good example, right? We need to figure out how we can align both, right? Otherwise, one is always going to be putting brakes into the other in a way.
I think that people who tell you that have a very romantic view of open source. And I've been living in open source and breathing open source for a while, and that's not the case. Vendors are significant players and contributors. I don't look at it as community being those individuals that work from the basement at night and vendors. Actually, I see vendors as part of the community. They have vested interests, and it's fine. Also, the individuals, by the way, have vested interests. It could be a consultant that works in order to show his or her ability and knowledge around that. It could be other interests, but ultimately, everyone has a vested interest, and it's fine. The only thing is that they're all part of the community, and the question is if they still are able to effectively contribute and promote the community, or if it's becoming a conflict. If it becomes a conflict of interest, that's where the problem arises, and obviously more so with vendors. But ultimately, you have open source that is backed by individuals, and sometimes even single individuals, and that's a risk, because all of us saw what happened with Log4Shell, and when the vulnerability was discovered, then we realized how popular it was and how many dependencies existed there on GitHub and how many other libraries included that, and so on and so forth. And it was based on a couple of folks maintaining that project. So this is fragile for a company to base its mission-critical underlying infrastructure on such a library. Let's put it this way. So individuals is also a risk. And on the other hand, vendors also bear risk. We all remember in the observability space, for instance, when Elasticsearch was pulled off of open source and becoming closed source. And that's an impact by Elastic NV. These things are also risks because of conflict of interest. So we need to look at it in a mature fashion. We need to have diversity around that. For example, I can tell you that we use internally M3DB that started off as an internal project by Uber, and then they contributed it to the open source, and then they carried on maintaining. But actually, Chronosphere, that was a new company by ex-Ubers that established around essentially this open source, contributed more and becoming very active. And now it's becoming less active. And then you're saying, okay, so what's next? Where is the project going? And because you're dependent on a single vendor, then there's a major question mark about the future of the open source. So I think diversity is the most important thing. Having a mix of vendors and end users is also very critical. especially something that is not just a tool, but also in a way an open specification, which OpenTelemetry is also. Open specifications could not be driven only by vendors. An excellent example that I actually got to discuss at KubeCon, and I'm going to devote an episode to. I'm a podcaster as well. My podcast is called Open Observability Talks, and I'm going to hold an episode with a fellow from eBay, Vijay Samuel, who together with another gentleman from Netflix started an open specification, open standardization effort around query languages, having a query language standard for observability across different signals and types and so on and so forth. And the fact that when I talked about that at KubeCon, I said the fact that it starts off from end users, from especially major hyperscalers such as eBay and Netflix, gives it good odds of succeeding rather than if it had started by a vendor. So that's my take, at least in a nutshell.
Yeah, I could probably argue that as an example, right? The major reason why Kubernetes is so successful today is, apart from people liking it and using it and stuff like that, is because it was adopted by a significant number of vendors, right? Kubernetes wouldn't be even close to where it is today if you didn't get Google's and Azure, Microsoft's and AWS's and so on and so forth of the world to actually have commercial interests in it. When we align the common interests, then we get something really, really great. For sure.
And by the way, let's be honest. I think that Kubernetes back in the day was not the clear contendant. We remember Mesos and remember others that I can tell you in many respects, it wasn't the superior solution. So that just goes to show that the one that will actually win, in a way, the competition is not necessarily strictly purely on the technical basis, but also, as you said, about who backs it, who is behind it, who actually adopts it and implements it in-house, and will later on also contribute and evolve the project. So that's a great example of that, I think.
You were talking about the romantic view of open source. You talked about the vendors, and you talked about the guys that still lived with their moms. No, the guy in the basement. How can we help people understand where they can start with open source? Because we'll see posts on Reddit and elsewhere. It's like, I'm a fresher or I'm wanting to get into this. What open source project can I start contributing to today to learn fill in the blank? And that question is usually, to me, a bit misguided, because if it's a strong project, strong community, you're not going to be committing to mainline anytime soon. So how do we help people set their expectations when contributing to open source?
That's a great question, and there are lots of factors here. First of all, it's about what that person wants to specialize or develop skills in terms of programming languages. Like Go is very popular in the CNCF, but then you see outside lots of Java. So do you want to go the Go way because it's sexy and lots of open source? Or do you want to go something that will help you find jobs in other places? So programming languages, frameworks, domains, obviously front-end, back-end, that's the classic division that people should have some sort of a sense of where they're more attracted to or where they want to develop in. But then again, also aspects such as, let's say, data streaming, data processing versus and analytics versus things such as databases. Some people go deep dive. I mentioned M3DB. So people that wanted to, I had a fellow of mine that wanted to really understand the inner doings of databases and started contributing there. So really depending on that. It also depends on where the project is in the maturity life cycle. Maybe there are programs, for example, the CNCF has all sorts of mentorship programs where you can get someone to guide you through this experience. This is also very important for freshers. So this should be a definite part of the consideration, and you can get involved in, let's say, Jaeger with some mentorship program. For a certain period of time. And then you also, it's not a long-term commitment. You have something very structured that also is important. Some people are okay with just jumping to the water and starting finding them themselves. Some people need something more of a structured program for ramping up. So a 3-month program, let's say, that they can align with. Just a few of the examples. Obviously, a small one, like you have 1-2 maintainers and you want to join and become more prominent, or you want to join a much larger project and do something very, very specific, one screw outside of the major project like OpenTelemetry. So another aspect to decide, just to give a few considerations.
To me, the most important question anybody should ask themselves is, first, what are you passionate about? I really dislike the question like, which project should I join? Which project do you use? To me, that's the first question, right? What is the thing you like? I honestly don't think that people should just join a random project because somebody recommended. Hey, go to OpenTelemetry, right? Or any other. To me, that's almost silly because everybody's using something. Pick one of the 5 things that you're using, and to me, that's the first step in a way.
Definitely. Start where your passion lies, where you want to evolve, what interests you, and that's for sure.
So as a CNCF ambassador, what does that title involve? Do you go around to neighborhood parades and get on a float and wave at people? What is your commitment level there?
Not yet. Maybe I'll start doing that as well. But it's a relatively new program. The CNCF Ambassadors program has been around for some time, but becoming really stale, I think, and somewhat neglected by the CNCF. And then they realized that the CNCF realized that it needs this program, and then a whole revamp was made. And at the last KubeCon Europe in Amsterdam, it was announced. Let's call it CNCF Ambassadors V2.0. And also accepting more ambassadors, and some of the ambassadors that were before were stayed, some did not stay. So it's a program in the making, but the main thing is about helping with distributing the message, exposing people to the CNCF, its stack, its ecosystem in any way possible, which for me was very natural because I actually did much of that even before getting the official CNCF ambassador title. So I went around. I was even at KubeCon last year on stage talking about OpenTelemetry and things like that. So for me, it was a natural. It wasn't really a shift in my focus. It was taking it to the next level in terms of getting their buy-in. It's not that you feel it very extensively, like they sponsor you around the world, traveling or doing things like that. And I think the program is still building up, so they're open for feedback. But ultimately, for me, it boils down to using, for example, my podcast, Open Observability Talks, to expose the status of open source based observability solutions, and using my speaking engagements in DevOps days and KCDs and whatnot, container days, to talk about these topics and write about these topics, and meetups, and whichever form that I can engage with the community to help both sharing the knowledge, also getting feedback from the community, and getting people to talk to each other. That's in a nutshell, at least for me. But it's not the formal definition, so that's just the way I view it.
So you've internalized it. You were already doing the job, if you will, prior to them making you an ambassador. But here we are in 2023. What is the message of the CNCF today? Because it's got to be different than when it first started.
Yeah, well, when the CNCF started, it was primarily Kubernetes. Let's be very honest. That was the first project that Google donated, and essentially around which the CNCF was established. By now, it's far beyond that. So you still have lots of pieces that connect, but you get things that are far beyond just, let's say, operating and monitoring Kubernetes. You see things that address FinOps, that address security, that address feature flags, product aspects like feature flags. So it's really a CI/CD and continuous deployments. So that's why they try to shift from Kubernetes to cloud native to more adequately depict it. But the name stuck with Kubernetes. But ultimately, that's where I see it. Functions as a service, open source based, obviously cloud native, so containerized, serverless. But you may argue that the definition is becoming more blurry as the scope expands. And also some of that borders other foundations, even under the Linux. CNCF is affiliated with the Linux Foundation. And you have other foundations under that umbrella, like the CDF, the Continuous Deployment Foundation, and you have the FinOps Foundation. And some of these are actually like starting to interface, if not more. And the question begs, okay, so what's the relation between and where should one thing go? And so on. So, for example, I raised an extension proposal for OpenTelemetry. It's called an OTEP, OpenTelemetry extension proposal, for OpenTelemetry to cover CI/CD observability. Observability for CI/CD as a first-level citizen. And one of the first thing that I flagged on the proposal was, hey, the neighboring foundation, the Continuous Delivery Foundation, the CDF, already started work on trying to formalize what a CD event looks like. So we can actually collaborate and we can actually maybe utilize that CD event specification as the semantic conventions and the data structures that OpenTelemetry can then ingest and process and support. So there's a potential here for collaboration. That's one example. Another example, for example, is OpenCost, a new project under the CNCF that addresses FinOps related aspects, understanding the cost of your Kubernetes workloads. And again, you'd say, okay, but they're also a certified solution on the FinOps org. So what's the relation and where does it fit best? That's where it becomes maybe a bit blurry. But on the other hand, a place for growth and collaboration.
So take off your ambassador hat for just a minute. Are there now too many foundations?
Too many? It's a good question. Many of the most popular open source projects are found under the Apache Foundation. So whether the CNCF and the Apache Foundation should join forces in a way, because some of the projects there, like, Lucene, is strictly on the, not strictly, but definitely very well aligned with observability, although it can serve maybe other things for enterprise search, but definitely on observability, Lucene is widely popular. So some of these are, again, become blurry, but I think different foundations have different spirits of things. For those who have been involved with them, you know that the Apache Foundation is very much of a hardcore developers and not much of the marketing layer, whereas the CNCF and the Linux Foundation have much more of an elaborate marketing layer on top of that, and the governance policies are not exactly the same. And so it's a good question, but then it comes down to things that are not technology. It's about each one evolved with its own dynamics, its own community. And I would go the path of just finding the places to connect and to collaborate between the communities rather than trying to flatten things out. That's my view.
So you mentioned their governance policies. Something to me that's associated with that is open source licenses. Where do we stand? Because we could go back to the old GPL days. We can go with MIT, all these licenses. If somebody is open source today, here's a loaded question. Which license should they pick?
Well, that's the best answer I can give is it depends, because the licenses are really licenses are legal. First of all, I'm not a lawyer, so I'm not I can't serve as an expert and advise on that. That's for sure. But it's all, as being a legal thing, it's about the fine print and about what's important for you and where you want to take the project, what kind of liberties you want to give versus what things you want to keep close to your chest. So it really depends. And we can see that these things also evolve over time. We see companies such as Grafana Labs that decided that has been for years advocate of Apache 2.0 and then relicensing its projects to AGPL version 3. So you see that even the same company with the same mission statement at some point in time realized that doesn't fit its business model. So it boils down to your business model, the ability to have a sustainable business model on top of your open source. Otherwise, you find yourself needing to do defensive actions, and how you balance the community with these business goals.
Business model. So your day job is actually at logs.io. That's logz.io. Logs, can I call it logs? Is based on open source. If you go out and take a look at the site, you're going to see splatted everywhere open source. Open source, open source, open source. powered by open source. Why is that so important specifically to the company you work at today?
Logs.io, essentially, to put it in a nutshell so people understand, the listeners understand the context, provides an observability, a cloud-native observability platform, a SaaS, that is based on or powered by, as you said, open source tools. And that's part of the mission statement of the organization. So you know and love Prometheus, you'll get Prometheus. You know and love Elasticsearch or OpenSearch, you'll get OpenSearch. You know and love Jaeger, you'll get Jaeger. OpenTelemetry and so on. So you get the open source that you know and love, but without the hassle of installing, maintaining, upgrading, taking care of the shards and where the indices go and the rebalancing and whatnot, all the pain that whoever managed these clusters at scale knows what I'm talking about. So the very origins of this company that started from only log analytics, that's why the name Logs. It started from log analytics based on the Elk stack back in the day that it was open source and providing that, and has evolved to a full-fledged observability platform, as I said, with Prometheus and the Grafana and Jaeger and others, but ultimately with the experience that the community likes. So the community likes, you can talk about how many users Datadog has or Splunk or New Relic or whatnot, but ultimately the masses are still with do-it-yourself with the open source. And they like it. The only thing is that at some point they reach this glass ceiling that as they scale out, it's too much for them. It's too much, and it becomes a headache also to correlate between different disparate tools. So, it's Jaeger is not connected in any way to your Prometheus, to your whatnot. And having a holistic experience and a managed experience without this headache is the benefit that Logs.io brings to the customers. But you get your open source that you know and love in terms of the APIs, in terms of the UI, in terms of the JSONs behind it. You can export your JSON from Grafana and import it straight as is there, and you get the same experience. So really, that's the mission statement.
So again, logs.io is logz.io. And Dotan, you said you have a podcast called the Open Observability Talks.
Yes, Open Observability is one word, Talks. You can find it on YouTube or on all the podcast apps, Spotify, Apple, Google, whatnot. I do that once a month. I live stream the episodes themselves. So for people who like chiming in on the live chat, but the main thing is the podcast for listening. And it's pretty cool about DevOps, observability, SRE, open source, obviously, and related topics like platform engineering and many more. So you can find it everywhere. And if you don't find it, reach out to me at Horovits. My surname, luckily enough, is my name on GitHub, on LinkedIn, on Twitter, on Mastodon, everywhere. Medium, my personal blog. So just Horovits, Horovits. You can reach out to me anywhere.
Out of your episodes you've done, let's say this year in 2023, what has been the most interesting one so far? If people had to go and watch one thing, what is that one thing you would want them to see?
It's interesting because actually now, again, we're recording this June, and that's the end of the third season of my show. So I've just written a recap about the last year, and I think the most popular episode, looking at the stats, was about OpenTelemetry. Sorry for bringing it up again. I had the honors of having Alolita Sharma. Each episode, I do that with a guest that's an expert from the community or industry. And that was with Alolita Sharma, who is on the technical advisory board for observability, tag observability on the CNCF, and also on the governing committee for OpenTelemetry project. So, and we talked about what's the state of OpenTelemetry, where it's heading, and what's the vision, and what's the practicalities. That was an amazing episode. And the latest episode, being a prisoner of the moment, it was about Backstage, which, as I said, the CNCF broadening so widely that the boundaries. So Backstage is like about internal developer platforms, platform engineering challenges. Started off from Spotify, and I had the honor of having Lee Mills, the senior manager from Spotify, who actually built it with his team from scratch and then open sourcing it. It was fascinating twofold. First, about hearing the pains and the journey of a project internally, and then hearing about how to take something that is an internal tool and then taking it and contribute it to the open source. For an organization that is not, it's not the DNA. Spotify is a music shop, ultimately. It's not a technology shop that sells tools. And suddenly, not just having a tool, just open sourcing it was an amazing experience, and pitching it internally to the management to actually get the buy-in and then doing it in practice. So I also love this journey from Spotify to open source. That's a special episode.
So go check out those episodes. And by the way, never apologize for bringing up OpenTelemetry. People that have been listening know that I'm not the hugest fan of Kubernetes. I'm fine with it, but I'm not a huge fan. But OpenTelemetry is a completely different story. So thanks for bringing that up. If you haven't listened to his podcast yet, go check out the Spotify episode about Backstage. And why not check out about OpenTelemetry? Because if you still haven't listened to our episodes about it, go listen to his. If you have listened to ours, go listen to his. You get the point. Dotan, thanks for being with us today.
Thank you very much for having me.
We hope this episode was helpful to you. If you want to discuss it or ask a question, please reach out to us. Our contact information and a link to the Slack workspace are at devopsparadox.com/contact. If you subscribe through Apple Podcast, be sure to leave us a review there. That helps other people discover this podcast. Go sign up right now at devopsparadox.com to receive an email whenever we drop the latest episode. Thank you for listening to DevOps Paradox.